All right. Hello, Catholic YouTube. Brian with City of the Immaculata back with you in a new year. Merry Christmas, everyone. Happy New Year. I think we are now at the, 12th day of Christmas. So the old Christmas tree is officially coming down in our home because we're in a new place with lots of pine trees. So or spruces rather, and we decided to put up the Christmas tree, a real tree this year. So it's officially dropping all of its needles. A little bit of a sad day for the family, but c'est la vie. We will come back around again next year. I hope you all had a wonderful Christmas. I hope you are enjoying this season and this time. I know that the New Year's is but a mere social construct, but I actually really enjoy the new year. I think it's a time of, reflection for me, especially as it relates around the incarnation of our Lord and many of the things that are important to me and what I want to do with this channel. As you all know, as someone who made my intention of this channel to elevate the medieval, and in particular, the medieval Franciscan tradition, I was thinking, a good place to start this new year would be on this particular topic that we're going to be covering today. And the goal of this lecture is to really start diving deeper into some of the themes of where I want this channel's focus to be, at least for now. It's always a bit of a catch when it comes to making content. I'm sure as if any of you out there have, are content creators, trying to find your voice and find what you are attempting to do in all of this. And it's been, sort of a roller coaster ride for me with this channel. But I really do want to hone in on some specific things that I initially intended to do with this channel. And, we'll see how it goes. We'll see how you guys like it. Speaking of liking it, if you could, preemptively, before you decide that this is an awful video, just go ahead and hit that like button for me, or hit the dislike button. It doesn't matter. The YouTube algorithm gods have decided that both will help share this video. So your engagement actually helps me, these lectures get out to a little bit of a wider audience than they would have otherwise. So I appreciate it, guys. Per this particular lecture, I could have started easily with Paris. And we'll probably come around at some point as we're focusing on some of these things. We're going to get to the University of Paris in time. But since it is a real interest for me personally, I wanted to begin in a place that you guys may find a little more surprising, which is the University of Oxford. And full disclosure, I love the history of Oxford. As an Anglophile, you kind of have to, because it's instrumental in shaping the religious identity of the English for centuries. And as we will today begin by honing in on two of her most, in my opinion, her most important students, Blessed John Duns Scotus of the 13th century and St. John Henry Newman of the 19th. And I think this will be a good illustration, as there are some very interesting parallels between the theology of these two men, despite the fact that they are centuries apart and that the Reformation, happened in the intervening years. And I'm somehow convinced that there is a spirit of Oxford that survived even the devastations of the Reformation. And my goal is to cover the development of the university and then some of its theological developments, and then to use Scotus as my reference for the medieval period and Newman for the modern period, and then sort of see how they're tied together. As far as the development of the university itself, we're not quite for sure how it came to be. Generally, what happened in the 10th leading into the 11th centuries is that you would have these houses that were connected to the cathedrals. These houses were formed as centers for learning, for catechesis, for training for would-be clergy. The University of Paris, of course, being the exemplar of this model. And from there, charters would form, and the houses eventually became independent from the cathedral, which is its own interesting and fascinating story and some of the controversies that surrounded that. University of Paris, again, being the exemplar model of this. And from there, you would have these independent houses, these bodies of learning give birth to what we would today recognize as the modern university model. Now, it seems that what happened per England is that the students of Paris were coming back to the island and coalescing around. At this time, there was at this early period where we get the sort of mysterious founding of Oxford. We do know that there was a banning of students from attending Paris in the middle of the 12th century, which seems to have been the impetus for these students setting up shop around the area of Oxford. And after a while, students would return back from Paris, and this would be like the central spot that they would return to. The curriculum in these early periods, leading all the way up through the High Middle Ages, consisted of the standards of the time, which would be as a young university student, you would learn the trivium, grammar, logic, rhetoric, and the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy. And then over time, as this evolved to include the philosophy, theology, and the law that was particular to the Middle Ages. Theology, of course, was the pinnacle, the apex of one's education. And there was a post that went out recently for those of you that dare to venture into the world of X. There was a post that went out by a Dominican, I believe, and someone from the Order of Preachers that stirred up some controversy among the traditionalists, where he was saying that most of the I don't know if he said most, but he said many of the problems that stem from the traditional movement is that so much of the theology is sort of locked in the Latin language, and that we don't have access to it, especially here, like in the English-speaking world. And for whatever reason, that seemed to have stirred up some traditionalist resentment. But there's actually quite a bit of truth to that. And when you're dealing with a theologian in the Middle Ages, you've got somebody that is spent a whole lot of time in these pre-studies before they would ever begin to touch something like theology. So you don't just get a Thomas or a Bonaventure or a Scotus before you went through this very rigorous process leading up to their working. Now, there was a spirit of lively debate within the culture of the university system designed to help you hone your rhetorical skills as well. It was part of the sort of dialectical method that was prevalent of the period. And, I get a little frustrated by the culture of debate that's so prevalent online. But the reality was that there is a history of disputation as well within the Western Church. The big difference, though, is the people that were involved in these disputations in this period. One, they were all sort of beginning with a sort of commonality of Catholic foundationalism, and then they were also very well prepared to debate their positions before they even began. Whereas today, it's just it's a mess. The debate culture is a mess. So when you see me challenging the debate culture today, keep in mind that I acknowledge and respect the fact that we do have a long history and pedigree within the university world in particular of debates, but there is some serious differences. Okay. As far as the dialectical method goes, the challenge was how far do we incorporate the contradictions of the fathers, the seeming contradictions of sacred scripture, and the challenges posed at the time by this newly introduced Aristotelian model of cosmology into a cohesive Catholic context. This is why it's important, because even today, the idea of university, to borrow from Newman, is that the university should be a place where well-trained academics explore ideas and challenge existing ideas, not so much to subvert, as seems to be the model today, but to hone and strengthen the ideas. And this is why, even today, you get some very lively debates that you will see come out of Oxford, because it hasn't lost that spirit of its founding. Now, there has been, of course, a real attempt to hijack the university, especially here in the United States, but probably across the Western world, if not the world at large, to co-opt them for certain ideological purposes. But that's a topic for another day. So into this world, into this, by the middle of the 12th century, the friars began coming to Oxford, the newly formed mendicant orders, principally the Grey Friars and the Black Friars, as they were known, which would be, of course, the Franciscans and the Dominicans. And they would be expected to live out their lives of austerity and poverty while also cultivating this spirit of learning. And this is actually more challenging than you may realize. It's central in many ways, I think, to Father Fellner's critical question, how does one reconcile the love of learning with the desire for God? And in this period, there was a debate on simple things we take for granted today, like could the Grey Friars own books? And it was the impetus for the later fracturing of the orders over this issue. But anyways, for our first person, for John Duns Scotus, it is into this world that he would have entered the University of Oxford in the 13th century. And we actually have little of his life, which is a bit frustrating for someone like myself who wants to try and tie the sociological factors of one's upbringing to their life and their ideas. We do know that he entered the university as a young man. He would have went through all of the traditional curriculum, as we just discussed, and by 1291, he is ordained into the priesthood, making him about 25 at that point. As a Grey Friar, he would have been actively participating in their life of prayer, of study, of poverty, and he begins lecturing in 1300 on Lombard sentences, the required compilation of text used by medieval scholars. So we can say certain things, at least about where he would have been in his academic training by this point. Now, as a lecturer, this means that you this does not mean that you have yet acquired the status of master, but it would have been a part of the requirements towards fulfilling those obligations. As a master, you'd have had more leeway to be involved in speculative theology. You weren't simply lecturing on Lombard at that point. You were actually teaching in the truest sense. Your words would have more authority. So again, we want to approach this from the modern lens of what's happening online. There's a difference between, say, what I would consider myself. Dare I even begin to make any comparisons to myself and the great minds of this period and the great training that they had. But I would simply be somebody who was on that low level of attempting to teach theology at a very minor level of what I do on this channel, and what many of you people who are involved on social media and the YouTube world, much of what you're doing is accessing the already formulated, what Bonaventure would call symbolic theology. We're not, and we should not be involved, in my personal opinion, and I think with the backing of the general magisterium of the church, we should not be involved in speculative theology online so much. Maybe between Catholics, but as we engage the world at large, and this is a challenging thing for me too, because this kind of contradicts some of my opinions that Catholics shouldn't be so, it's seeming contradiction that Catholics shouldn't be so afraid to express ourselves, in terms of these. What's coming to my mind is recently on Twitter, I had a viral post about the speculative theology of Maximilian Kolbe, and To my surprise, it kind of took off, and there was a lot of Protestants very upset with that post. And there was a lot of Catholics that were sort of saying, Brian, maybe you should, maybe, we gotta be kind to the Protestants, right? We shouldn't be doing speculative theology in front of the Protestants. Okay, point taken. I probably should keep my mouth shut sometimes, but I love the theology of Maximilian Kolbe, and I do think that there's a place for us to have among Catholics having these conversations. Anyways, I'm getting way far afield here. So he's a lecturer. He's lecturing on Lombard sentences. And as you become a master, as you move towards that, then your work takes on a little bit higher level of authority. Now, fast forward several centuries to the 1820s. The Reformation has taken place. Monasteries are all absolved. All of the religious orders of Oxford have been removed, have been liquidated. And despite the temptation, the university somehow managed to maintain a degree of independence. Now, there were periods, of course, where for example, one of the tragedies of the Reformation and the subsequent period afterwards is that many of the writings of Blessed John Duns Scotus were apparently tossed to the wind by Protestant reformers who just absolutely despised him. But for the most part, the spirit of the Oxford University, there's probably been times where it was more suppressed, but it somewhat survived. And by that, I mean, sort of an independence from the temporal powers that are maybe trying to hold sway over the academic realm of what was and was not allowable to be said at university. The general collegial philosophy is that higher education was to be a place of open exchange. Because of this, there also arose in this 18th century. Where are we at now? I'm sorry. 19th century. Because of this, there arose in the 18th century at Oxford a real interest in patristic and medieval studies. Whereas in general, the public in England and in Britain in particular, you wouldn't have uttered such ideas. At university, you could seriously engage the medievals on their own terms and, not have the authorities of the church breathing down your neck so much. Into this steps our other great protagonist, the wonderful, soon-to-be doctor of the church, mark my words, St. John Henry Newman. And while the curriculum was certainly different in many ways than what you would have had during Scotus's lifetime, it is still a very rigorous education in the time of Newman. He would have been required to learn Latin, Greek, philosophy, rhetoric, formal logic, theology, and of course, the debate culture still existed. So all of these skills would be put to test on a consistent basis, and he would have had a very rigorous training for sure. Newman, in many ways, has helped to shape and define the church in a modern context, and where he hasn't, we should actually, I think, be engaging his work and thought to a much higher degree than we have. Personally, I find his Grammar of Assent to be a masterpiece of epistemology. I actually have a book in the works that I plan on working on in the next couple of years, and the idea of the illative sense that is drawn out of Newman is something I heavily going to lean into in that book. So how do these two thinkers overlap in this question? There isn't much by way of direct reference to Scotus on Newman's part, but all one has to do is really spend time with Newman to see that there is in fact a direct and immediate influence. Considering the primacy of will, the idea of intuition, of the first process of intellection, a high Christocentric theology, and an emphasis on the Immaculate Conception in Mariology. I mean, it abounds, folks. Like it's pretty stark once you begin to see it. And I want to share here a graph that I actually borrowed from. Let me see here. Always takes me a minute to go back to how to share. Okay. All right, that's it. Let me see if I can adjust the size now. All right, so hopefully you guys can see this. This is from Father Peter Fellner's work. It's called on what is the work called? It's a dialogue between Scotus and Newman per Father Peter Fellner's symposium that he put on several years ago. So, as you can see at the top, there is Bonaventure, Scotus, and Newman, and then it's a list of various different philosophical theological propositions that they held that were actually uniform in some ways across the board between the three of them. So we'll just discuss this for a little while here because I think it's just a super fascinating. So, for example, if you take where's let's see, for example, contuition. Let's start with that. For Bonaventure, contuition is this knowledge that transcends the normal process of abstraction. And by abstraction here, we mean in the Aristotelian sense, where we come across an object. This object emits properties that our mind comes to grasp by creating a phantasm of that thing in the mind. Well, this is different than this idea of contuition is different than that. Now, Bonaventure doesn't reject abstraction, neither would Scotus or Newman. But the problem is that Bonaventure and Scotus do not see this as justifying certain knowledge. For this, he postulates contuition, which is a more direct grasping of the essence of a thing that is extra mental. It is not a process whereby the mind works on the object. It's where the mind sort of grasps the object outside of the process of abstraction. And similar to contuition is Scotus's idea of intuition, which for him is it's the first act of the mind when it comes into contact with being in particular. And Scotus says, even before we begin the discursive process of abstraction, the mind already intuits the thing abstracted, which will play directly into his ideas of the univocity of being, just as it does, contuition does for divine illumination in Bonaventure, and as the univocity of knowledge would in Newman, which we will get to. So for Newman, it is a real apprehension, which he explains in his Grammar of Assent. And this is a real encounter with the thing for the first person subject, as opposed to a notional apprehension, which does not require an immediate contact with the thing. So the idea here, guys, is that when we experience the world around us, how do we come to know things in a way that is certain that we can justify knowledge of the thing? As Bonaventure would put it, since the world is both unstable and mutable, we need something, some principle, and this is really an epistemological foundation that is, I think, neglected within the Western Catholic tradition, that the objects are contuited, intuited, or really apprehended before we even begin the discursive process of abstraction, which would have to be per Hume, per Kant, justified in other ways. As far as abstraction goes, for this, all three postulate that abstraction is a real process. I explained Bonaventure for abstraction, and I actually have a playlist on that. So if you guys want to like deep dive into that, I've already done so for Bonaventure. So just go check out the Bonaventure playlist on my channel. For Scotus, though, he has abstractive cognition, which when the mind comes to know through the intuition of the thing, but unlike intuition, the thing doesn't necessarily need to be immediately present. So it is through this abstractive cognition that one forms concepts in the Scotistic model. And for Newman, This is a notional apprehension where the idea of the thing comes into the mind and you can understand it, but through theories and general principles, it can be said that you come to, quote, know the thing to a degree. Not know that in the sense that you would if you come to a real apprehension where you apprehend the thing in its essence, but in this sort of notional, mental, conceptual way. So, for example, right, if I've never experienced cat before, you could explain cat to me, and I could come to a notional apprehension of cat. Whereas once I go out and I experience cat, I have a real apprehension of cat, wherein I, through contuition, through intuition, through real apprehension, I come to know the essence of the thing to a degree. Another example here from this list is de judicatio in Bonaventure, understanding in Scotus, and the illative sense in John Henry Newman, which is just one of my favorite things. If you guys want me to geek out for the longest time, I absolutely love this subject. But all of this gets us to the destination that we are seeking with these last things that we've been discussing, right? Intuition, abstractive cognition, understanding in Scotus, for example. Understanding is what the end goal is that we're trying to reach. With Scotus, understanding is where one doesn't just know the thing in an abstractive sense, but one knows it in its essence and in its nature. We don't just recognize the thing, but rather we understand it. Sorry, I just had a major drop off there, so let me see. Understanding for Scotus then involves a complex interplay between the direct experience of reality, the intuitive cognition, the abstraction of the concepts of things, the abstractive cognition, and the intellect's ability to discern the essence or the formalities within these concepts, leading us to a profound and nuanced comprehension of reality. In Newman, this is his famous illative sense, which I want to spend a lot more time on in the future. In much the same way that we find as understanding in Scotus, it is this complex interplay of intuitive cognition, abstractive cognition, where the knower comes to understand. The illative sense is this complex interplay of the subjective first person's experience, where evidence, intuition, disposition all converge in a certainty that sort of transcends a strict logical deduction of the thing. Newman's idea of the peasant farmer, for example, who knows it's about to rain, is a sort of famous illustration of what that's about, right? The farmer, the peasant, he's got all of these multiple things taking place at once, where when he steps outside, there is the sort of notional things that he has been aware of through the experiences of his life. And then there's this intuitive thing that takes place where when all of that stuff interplays together, he is able to tell that it is about to rain. Another area of commonality between these men is for Bonaventure. And this is, again, all of this stuff is related, guys. This is where I think, especially looking through the lens of Father Fellner, who I think in many ways was a great synthesizer, all of these ideas converge on the three masters, I think, most influential ideas of divine illumination, which I cover elsewhere on the Bonaventure playlist, but also univocity of being and the univocity of knowledge. I do have a video that introduces some of the key concepts around Scotus's univocity of being. The gist of it, though, is that Scotus wants a uniting feature that we can conceptually speak about things that are different in a meaningful way. So when I say something about man or about God, I want to have a unifying principle that is true, that allows my words and my concepts to be real and meaningful when I express them to you. And for Newman, this is the univocity of knowledge. Newman believes that there is this unifying essence underlying all knowledge. Ultimately, this is what we would call down to this transcendent principle of the true. All of these little participle seeds or pieces of knowledge that we acquire or come to are but a participation in the unifying truth that transcends all of the individual truths. And the unifying truth, the transcendental truth, of course, is greater than the sum of the parts by far. There's a disjunctive transcendental aspect to truth that when we participate in little truths that are here on earth, there's not a sense in which it is univocal towards the transcendent truth that is the infinite truth of God, which is the reality of all things. But there's also needs to be a sense in which our language, when we experience the truth here, even in a participle way, that it is unified for Newman by the knowledge that we attain to the divine truth, to the eternal truths. All of this may be esoteric for some of you, but it really gets at the heart at what I wanted to cover today. I could go through others here. For example, an important one is the absolute primacy of Christ in the Immaculate Conception. We find it explicitly, of course, in Scotus, more implicit in Newman. That, let's see, the dual primary predestination of Christ and Mary in the order of intention, known colloquially as the absolute primacy of Christ in the Immaculate Conception. Now, most people, if they know anything about Scotus at all, are aware of the fact that, and this is rightly so, that the Scotus is known for his defense of the Immaculate Conception. The subtle doctor was an adamant defender of this tradition. Interesting fact, though, considering we are, discussing the English tradition here, the celebration of Mary being conceived. Let me go ahead and stop share. The celebration of her being conceived has its origins actually in the East. As you can read in the works of Father Capes, for example, a really great modern scholar of the Eastern tradition, and I think he has shown quite convincingly that in some seed form, this doctrine was available to the faithful coming out of the Byzantine tradition. Now, in the Western tradition, being heavily influenced by Augustine and his doctrine of original sin, we've always been very hesitant to extend to Our Lady this title in these early periods of this discussion, let alone an acceptance of the doctrine, except for one place, which was the Dowry of Mary, England. It's an amazing thing when you consider just how far the English Reformation fell. But in the medieval times, England was known for its love and veneration of Our Lady, so much so that it's known as the Dowry of Mary. And it was almost without parallel in this respect. And somehow, while it was all but rejected on the continent, a feast of Our Lady's Immaculate Conception took root in England. When a theological opinion enters the calendar, even if it's just a local calendar, it gives the opinion a greater degree of authority. Lex orandi, lex credendi, right? So in England, the Dowry of Mary, this feast was present by the 10th and 11th century. It had time to percolate and develop, and the intervening centuries between when it was introduced to the calendar and when these arguments really got underway. And when the English people came to its defense, they were well equipped. And in some ways, they argued opinions that were over and against otherwise very great theologians of their day, especially from the continent. And in many ways, the Immaculate Conception is extracted as it develops from the Franciscan thesis, as it's known, the absolute primacy of Christ. One logically flows from the absolute primacy of Christ one logically flows from the Immaculate Conception back to the absolute primacy of Christ in a proximate sense, as they're intertwined and related. Now, as I mentioned, you don't find explicitly in Newman a layout of the absolute primacy of Christ, yet one does find a deep Irenaean, Maximian, as in Maximus the Confessor, emphasis on Christ's role in the cosmic order of things beyond just his role as a redeemer. And this is important because these two concepts, the cosmic significance of the Logos in creation and the intention behind the absolute primacy of Christ, are all fundamentally from within the same order of uh, viewing viewing one's cosmology and how we ascertain the purpose of reality. There's an emphasis on the Logos, as in the beginning, and there's this deep Christocentric mediation between the Word and the Father as it relates to the created order that one would find in Newman. And it's interesting that after all these years, there still lingered, this is just super fascinating to me, that there still lingered in the halls of Oxford this student who, through sheer prowess of his intellect and the graces bestowed upon him, I guess, John Henry Newman, was so far removed from the medieval Catholic English world, would still wind up in many of the similar places as his great antecedent, John Duns Scotus. And I don't think that's an accident. I think there's something innate in the English tradition that has borne this out over time, despite the tragic reality of the Reformation and all of the bad fruits. Excuse me, I'm not being ecumenical there, but all the bad fruits that arose from the Reformation. Despite that, you still get somebody like Newman coming along on the other end of it. But now, granted, like Newman's a very special case, but you also saw it in the Oxford movement as a whole. Edward Pusey. Now he never came over from the Anglican tradition. He didn't make that jump that Newman made, but all of these guys were attempting to reach back into the pre-Reformation world and to extract from that the Anglican tradition. They wanted to, there was basically a salvage, an attempt at salvaging the English church from the Reformation, which is ultimately where Newman came to land that was an impossible project. Some of the other Oxford movements came to, who stayed. And then, of course, many of your Anglo-Catholics to this day actually believe that it's a salvageable project that they have in their own minds worked out. Ultimately, though, I think there was a failure of that. But anyways, that's beyond the scope of what I'm talking about here. The main purpose is that I think that this is a part of the greater true tradition of the English church. When I think of the English church, the reality of the Reformation is always kind of there, linger in the background. Yes, I mean, you think about, I know Cranmer was a Cambridge man, but it's a similar story in some respects. I think Cranmer set up Vermigli at Oxford, and he set up Bucer at Cambridge. I may have that backwards, but basically these guys gutted these institutions and attempted to completely extract and remove all of what I think is the authentic true tradition. But obviously it didn't work because of the great minds of somebody like Newman, who was able to come along and, again, maybe through his own, the sheer prowess of his academic intellect, he's almost without parallel among his contemporaries. He was able to sort of tap back into this wider tradition that goes back to Scotus. And another thing that you really need to keep in mind about all of this is that even in the Catholic world at the time of Newman, it's not like you could just readily turn to Scotus, even going back to the continent, because by the time of Newman, you're really dealing with the aftermath of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars and all of the wars of unification that are taking place at the time, which utterly decimated the Franciscan tradition. It's amazing that we even still have any of it to this day, but be that as it may, it's not like Newman had this like massive access to these things. He would have been primarily, his exposure would have been to the patristics and his study in the ancient church. Newman was super fascinated with the Arian controversy. One of his final works that he ever wrote was on the Arian controversy, and he still, like I said, he still managed to uh, come up with this unifying bridge between himself and somebody like John Duns Scotus, who, as I said, unfortunately, Scotus took two hits. He took the hit of the Reformation, and then he took the hit of the Enlightenment, and yet still one of the greatest minds of the period was able to tap back into that. So I just think that's a wonderful thing, and I do think that's actually part of the wider tradition of the English Church that I don't think it's enough recognition. And I think we as Catholics, we have our own patrimony in the English Church that is incumbent upon us to start reclaiming. You know, when the when our Anglo-Catholic brothers and sisters want to, say that they are how do they say it? Well, we're not Roman Catholics, we're Catholics. So I would say, okay, well, we're not English Protestants, we're English Catholics. That's what we are, on our side of the things. I think to be English and to be Catholic is to be a part of this tradition of Scotus, of Newman, of this wider Oxford tradition. And, God willing, one day Oxford will once again be ours, but I think we're a long ways away from that in England. So let's see here. Haley's in the comments. Hello, Haley, if you're still around. Looks like I lost quite a few people there. Sorry about the delays in the... Pretty much all of the important standard texts in philosophy and theology are in Latin or Greek. Yeah, and this is surprise. This is one of the first things that you will learn as a student is just how much of the theology is locked in those two languages. And yeah, translators, God bless them. It is a important job. It's a very thankless job. So, we should be supporting our translators as so much as they try to put these things into English for us, but that's a slow process. Most of it's still in another language, and most of it's not going to be translated within our lifetimes because it's not it's a hard work and it doesn't have a lot of payoff. So absolutely, and I don't think that's a controversial statement. It shouldn't be a controversial statement. It's one of the first things that you learn. Oh, I guess I do have to learn Latin. It's not just some archaic language. It's that most of our theology is still in those languages. Most of what you're going to learn about Scotus is not in the English language. So that's just the reality of it. All right, so that's what I had for you with this one, guys. Again, I'm super excited about the new year and some of the things that I want to do with this channel. I've got some interesting things lined up for you. Some interesting people are going to be joining me. We're just trying to work on some schedules and getting the people on here, but I really want to press some of these important things. I'm going to try to be a greater presence of positivity and what little influence that I have on the Catholic world. And by positivity, I mean like actually not just like putting on a smile, where things are sometimes awful, but really like actually presenting the faith, I think, in a way that is true and alive and helps people kind of become on fire about their faith, because that's what we all want, right? We want people that are on fire about there's faith, and there's many rooms in the Father's house, and there's a lot of room for all of us. And even if you guys don't necessarily enjoy some of the academic sides of the stuff, there's still, I think, other positive channels for you to find out there. But for me, I want to turn some of these like academic conversations into something that is affective, that helps people reach and achieve the holiness that we all desired. Because I think there is to not put a positive spin on it, I think there is a deep lacuna and a deep need for sanctity and holiness that a lot of us are struggling to. How do I want to say this? A lot of us are. It's not that we're struggling to present it. It's that we're struggling to make it transformative for the people that are listening. Because all you have to do is spend a little bit of time on social media, and you can see that we're all in a bad way. This is not just Catholics. The Christian world in general is in a bad way, but I want to see Catholics as the model for sanctity. I want to see Catholics producing saints, holy men and women of all stripes and all sizes and all colors and one creed. But anyways, that's all I got for you guys today. You know, there's no real questions in it, so I appreciate you tuning in. I've got some great interviews coming up, so stay tuned for those and some other really good content that I think you guys are going to enjoy. But God bless you all, and I will see you next time. I just want to make sure there's no comments that I'm missing here. No, that's it. God bless you all.
Honey, their coffee can't hold a candle to yours.
Instant Folgers taste good as fresh perked.
This is Earth, the year 2100. This is the headquarters of Space Patrol. And men from Earth, Mars, and Venus live and work there as guardians of peace.
In the nation's capital, President Johnson today welcomed British Prime Minister Douglas Hume.